There are very few people on American television who have earned the word trusted in the deepest, most personal sense of that word. Not trusted the way you trust a news anchor to read headlines correctly, or trusted the way you trust a game show host to follow the rules. Trusted the way you trust a neighbor who has helped you every single time something went wrong. That kind of trust is rare in this world, and it is even rarer on a television screen. But for more than 4 decades, one man built exactly that kind of relationship with millions of Americans. Not through charm, not through controversy, not through spectacle, but simply by showing up and doing the work with honesty. That man is Tom Silva. And at 77 years old, after decades of silence on matters that the public had been speculating about for years, he has finally decided to speak. For a generation of homeowners, the name Tom Silva is woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that almost no television figure can claim. They remember watching him on Saturday mornings when they were children, confused about why their parents cared so much about things like load-bearing walls and proper flashing detail. They remember watching him again as young adults in their first apartments, suddenly understanding with perfect clarity why those things mattered. And they remember calling up an old episode during their own renovation projects, trusting his calm voice more than the contractor standing in their own kitchen. Tom Silva was never entertainment in the conventional sense. He was education. He was reassurance. He was, for a very long time, a constant in a world that offered very few constants. But constants have a strange way of becoming invisible. When something is always there, people stop asking how it got there or what it cost to keep it there. For Tom, that invisibility was a deliberate, principled decision to stay focused on the work rather than the attention surrounding it. He never sought headlines. He never chased controversy. He never made careful public announcements designed to manage the way people perceived him. He simply worked, and he trusted that the work would speak for itself. For most of his career, it did. But somewhere along the way, his silence began to be misread. And the longer that silence continued, the louder and more creative the misreadings became. It began quietly, as most things do. A missed segment here. A stretch of episodes where a younger face stepped more visibly into the lead. Online forums, which have a unique talent for filling silence with the most dramatic possible interpretations, began threading conversations that circled the same basic question in a dozen different ways. What is happening with Tom Silva? The earliest discussions were gentle enough, curious, almost affectionate, the kind of concern that longtime fans express when someone they care about seems to have changed without explanation. But as seasons passed and no explanation came, the tone of those conversations shifted. The speculation sharpened. People began connecting dots that may not have belonged on the same map at all. Some concluded that he was being gradually eased out by producers who wanted a faster, younger, more visually dynamic format better suited to the streaming era. Others pointed to the physical demands of a lifetime in the construction trades and argued that a man approaching and then surpassing his mid-70s simply could not sustain what he had always done. A smaller number went further, suggesting private disputes and professional falling outs that had quietly transformed what was visible on screen. None of these theories originated with Tom. None were confirmed, corrected, or even acknowledged by him. He gave no interviews on the subject. He released no statements. He let the speculation exist the way he let most things exist, without interference. What those forums never quite understood was something fundamental about who Tom Silva is. He had never been the kind of person who explains himself. Not to producers, not to audiences, not to the internet. His entire professional philosophy, shaped over a lifetime doing real work in real conditions, was built on the conviction that quality speaks for itself. If you build something right, you do not need to give a speech about it afterward. If you teach someone something true, you do not need to follow the lesson with a press release. That principle had served him without fail for decades. But in an era defined by constant communication, instant opinion, and the expectation that public figures will narrate every moment of their own lives in real time, staying quiet began to read as hiding. And hiding began to imply that something was being hidden. Before any of the rumors can be properly understood, It is worth being honest about what a lifetime in the construction trades actually does to the human body. This is not a story unique to Tom. It is a story written in the hands, backs, hips, and knees of every skilled tradesperson who has spent decades doing demanding physical work without complaint and without ceremony. The industry does not talk much about this toll. The people who absorb it tend not to either. They were trained in cultures where you work through difficulty rather than discussing it, where the job gets done regardless of what the body is saying. Tom's spine had been accumulating the kind of damage that comes from years of heavy lifting, repeated bending, sustained physical strain across thousands of job sites before it finally reached a point that required surgical intervention. Recovery from that kind of procedure does not follow television schedules. The body that emerges from major back surgery is not quite the same body that went in. What Tom did in the aftermath was not retreat. He shifted his approach with the same kind of practical intelligence he had always applied to structural problems. He demonstrated more and lifted less. He explained principles with greater deliberateness. He turned teaching into its own form of skilled labor rather than simply a byproduct of doing the physical work himself. To viewers paying close attention, this represented a deepening of what he contributed. To those who were measuring his worth in screen time and physical demonstrations, it appeared to be withdrawal. Then, in early 2025, a fall fractured his hip. The response was consistent with everything that had come before. He healed according to medical guidance, made the necessary adjustments, and returned. He brought back with him a more focused emphasis on protecting the body on the job site, on preventing the accumulated damage he himself had absorbed over a career. He talked more directly with younger builders about ergonomics, about the decisions that seem small in your 20s and become life-altering by your 50s. The injury did not remove him from the work. It changed the texture of what he contributed to it. But for people already primed to interpret any change as decline, it confirmed what they had already decided to believe. None of those external pressures, however, not the production tensions, not the physical challenges, not the shifting demands of the television landscape, came close to doing what one event in 2018 did to Tom Silva quietly and permanently. That year, Austin Wilson, a young crew member on This Old House, died suddenly during an active filming season. To the general public, it was a brief, sad headline. To Tom, it was something altogether different. Austin was not simply a name in the credits. He was someone Tom had personally invested in, corrected, encouraged, and trusted on job sites. He had the qualities that Tom had spent a career looking for in young people in the trades: genuine curiosity, real discipline, a willingness to learn the craft the way it deserved to be learned rather than looking for the fastest path through it. Tom had always believed, as a matter of deep conviction rather than professional obligation, that passing genuine craft knowledge from one generation to the next was among the most important things a person in his position could do. Austin had represented the future he hoped that transmission was building. Losing him was not a professional setback. It was a personal devastation. People who worked closely with Tom in the period that followed saw the change almost immediately. He became quieter. He withdrew from the casual back and forth that had always characterized his presence on set. Meetings moved past with less of his input. There was a stillness about him that had not been there before, and it was not the stillness of peace. For months after Austin's death, Tom came closer to walking away from the show than he had at any other point in his career. The work had always been about building things that lasted and teaching others to do the same. With Austin gone, that purpose felt both more urgent and somehow unreachable at the same time. Teaching reminded him of who was not there to receive the lesson. The camera reminded him of an absence it could not acknowledge. He seriously, privately, considered whether continuing made any sense. What changed his direction came from Austin's family. They reached out to Tom, not with anger, not with blame, but with gratitude. They told him what Austin had said about working alongside him, how much it had meant to Austin to be taken seriously by someone who understood the craft the way Tom did. Those conversations did not remove the grief. Grief does not work that way. But they reframed what staying meant and what leaving would mean. Walking away would not honor what had been lost. Continuing, teaching, holding the standards that Austin had respected. That was the tribute that made sense. Tom re-engaged with the work, but he was not the same person who had stepped back from it. Grief had settled into him and changed the weight of everything he did afterward. Of all the things that have come to light about Tom Silva's life away from the camera, perhaps the most unexpected is what can now be confirmed about his work quietly supporting families who had lost their homes to disaster. Starting around 1999, long before social media had made public generosity into a kind of performance art, Tom began directing resources toward rebuilding efforts for families displaced by fires, storms, and structural failures. He did not do this through televised fundraisers or press-friendly donation ceremonies. He did it through a small entity connected to his family's construction business, eventually identified as the Silva Brothers Foundation, which allowed materials, labor costs, and temporary housing assistance to flow to families in need without creating visibility or credit. In some cases, the families receiving help were not immediately told who was behind it. When they did learn the truth, they were asked for one thing in return: privacy. Tom's reasoning reflected the same set of values that had shaped everything else about his professional life. He had watched enough charitable work conducted primarily for the benefit of the person doing it, the photograph, the public association, the brand building, that he wanted no part of that framework. These were people in genuine crisis. They were not props for anyone's story, including his. The work he did on their behalf was the same work he had always done. Assess what was broken, apply real skill and real resources to fixing it, then step back and let the repair stand on its own. This continued for over 2 decades. The scale varied. The geography varied. But the approach did not. In certain cases, Tom personally reviewed the quality of the rebuild work because he was constitutionally incapable of attaching himself, even invisibly, to something done carelessly. The standards he had fought to maintain on national television were the same standards he enforced in a private rebuild that no one would ever film. The truth emerged gradually in 2025 through accounts from people connected to various rebuilding efforts who had no particular reason, after so many years, to maintain the silence they had been asked to keep. What assembled itself from those accounts was not a portrait of performance. It was a portrait of consistent, unglamorous, deliberate care for people who needed it. When Tom Silva finally addressed the accumulation of public speculation that had followed him for years, what he confirmed was not the dramatic conclusion that online forums had been building toward. There was no farewell announcement. There was no revelation of a behind-the-scenes dispute. There was no concession that the industry had moved past him or that age had forced a retreat. What he confirmed was quieter than any of that, and, in its quietness, more revealing. He confirmed that he is still working, still present, still committed to the show, and to everything the show has always stood for. He confirmed that his role has changed not because of external pressure, but because of his own evolving understanding of where his contribution is most valuable. He no longer measures that contribution in the number of physical demonstrations he can perform in a given episode. He measures it in what he prevents: mistakes that would have become disasters, shortcuts that would have become failures, habits that would have cost someone years of expensive repair. He measures it in the builders he has helped become more capable and more careful than they would have been without him. He confirmed that the physical toll of his career is real, has required real adaptation, and that he considers that adaptation not a defeat, but a form of professional intelligence. He confirmed that grief in 2018 changed him at a level that he has never fully returned from, and that he does not expect to. He carries it as part of the weight of the work now, and that weight makes the work more serious and more necessary rather than less. And he confirmed, without asking for admiration, that for 25 years he had been doing something quietly for families with no homes and no resources, because he was someone who could and because someone needed to. The story the internet had been writing about Tom Silva for years was a story built almost entirely on absence, on what was not visible, not said, not explained. When someone stays quiet for long enough in public life, the silence becomes a canvas for whatever the observer is most afraid of. The story that filled itself in around Tom was a story of fading, of an institution slowly losing its relevance, of a man once central to something becoming increasingly peripheral to his own legacy. The story that has now come into focus is something else entirely. It is the story of a man who decided very early what he believed and spent the next 40 years testing that belief under every variety of pressure, professional, physical, personal, and grief-shaped, and finding, each time, that it held. The belief is not complicated. Do the work right. Teach it right. Let the work be the measure. Not the narrative around the work, not the perception of the work, not the amount of screen time the work generates. The work itself. That belief cost him things along the way. It cost him the comfort that comes when people understand what you are doing, because understanding required him to explain himself, and explaining himself was something he simply was not interested in doing. It cost him the relief of a clean public record, because a clean public record requires attention to public perception, and his attention was always elsewhere. But the same belief built everything that makes Tom Silva's 4 decades in television remarkable. The trust that viewers gave him was not accidental, and it was not the product of good casting. It was the product of a man who held the same standards in a nationally broadcast renovation and in a private rebuild for a family whose name no viewers would ever know. At 77, Tom Silva is not finished. He is not fading. He is doing what the best builders always do when they have mastered their trade and accepted the limits of their body. He is making sure the people who come after him know how to do it right. That has always been the work. It is still the work. And for anyone who has watched him long enough to understand what that means,